This is a lecture from Open Tuition. For the free lecture notes that go with this podcast, please visit opentuition.com.
Now we're going to look at the tools available for external appraisal. Broadly speaking, there are two models, frameworks, tools to use when looking at the external environment, or just the environment of a company or other organization. And the first one is what's called the PESTEL model. It used to be called PEST, then another EL was put onto it. You've almost certainly come across this before. This looks at what you might call the big macro environmental effects. Really large things happening in the environment, which by and large no company or organization can do very much to prevent or to alter. So a company will be looking at what's happening out there because it has to take account of that. And the first one is political. Examples of political events which may affect the strategic planning considerations of an organization could be an election coming up. So you've got two parties. One is all for lots of public spending, one is more for an austerity type of approach. Here you are, you're a company which is building roads, and you have to think, well, maybe what's the probability of a change of government and what's that going to do to the money available for me as a road builder. It could be political events like maybe changes in the European Union, people joining or even perhaps people leaving the European Union. What's that going to do to my market? What's it going to do to the cost and difficulty perhaps of doing business with members? It can be war, it can be a disruption as well. I think if you're an air company like British Airways and suddenly war breaks out somewhere, you have to abandon flying there, or you have to kind of fly around it and so on. Then there may be longer term effects that you need to take into account when thinking about your strategy. First is economic then. What's happening in the economy, is it boom or bust? But also in the economy, you can look again at public spending, you can look at tax rates, you can look at inflation rates, you can look at exchange rates, all of which are going to influence what organizations can do. Don't worry too much about whether you regard tax as being an economic matter or a political matter. It's not where you categorize tax or exchange rates. It is simply that you have remembered that tax may be important. So if sales tax is going to be increased by 5%, then you can kind of predict that may hurt my sales revenue, and maybe I shouldn't be thinking of building the new factory. S is social. Social matters, and one of the big social matters affecting many of the Western economies is the way the population, or the balance of the population, is aging. There's a bigger and bigger proportion of older people, smaller and smaller proportion of younger people. And if, for example, you are a pharmaceutical company, then that's good news, because older people, as diseases develop and so on, are relatively large consumers of pharmaceuticals. If you're in the business perhaps of producing educational products, a decline in the birth rate might be bad news. So habit, fashion also comes into social. Many of us have got into almost a habit of expecting to be able to have relatively cheap flights. And once the habit is entrenched, if you like, people might be reluctant to give that up. Next, we have technology. The technological changes. We've seen how an IBM, big effect, Kodak, big effect, Nokia, big effect. One of the major technology changes that's talked about in this paper is the influence of the internet. So now even very small companies, if they have an internet site, can really have a global audience, so they can. It maybe makes breaking into a business much easier It enables you to track what your customers are doing. It maybe enables you to do without bricks like banks and shops, and to do more of your trading and transactions online. So you need perhaps less expensive physical goods. The second E is either ecology or environment again. This is the increasing concern that people have about the environment, about greenhouse gases, release of noxious fumes and effluent into rivers and so on. The idea of recycling more and more. And it's not all just kind of ethical thought processes. Many of these matters are becoming expensive. There are increasing costs in many countries for disposing of waste. There may be carbon taxes in some countries. And it is important also to bear in mind what your customers and other stakeholders may want. They may want you and prefer you to be an ecologically concerned organization. And finally, there is legal. Legal used to be part of political. It's now been split out a little bit. New laws and regulations all the time coming, maybe about the safety of products, maybe about the minimum wages that you can pay somebody, or the maximum hours you can expect them to work in a week, or anti-discrimination laws and the like. You have to bear in mind that legal constraints will possibly affect the strategies which you're free to do. This calls itself a model, but again it's little more than a list of these 6 items, big macro events which people can't do very much about. You have to kind of live with them and adjust very often to suit what's happening. Now there are 2 particular kind of developments in the macro environment which are highlighted in the syllabus, and one is industry convergence, and the other one is global companies, or the international dimension. And we can deal with both of these together because they tend to have pretty much the same effect. So industry convergence is the sort of thing we've all seen in our mobile phones here. In early days, mobile phones only made phone calls. Now they make phone calls. They can provide GPS. They can browse the internet. They can take photographs. They hold your music and so on there. So you have in one consumer product maybe 6 consumer products, all have been kind of pushed into that. You see it on a company like Amazon, which started off just selling books, then it was books and CDs. Now it seems to be selling everything. And one of the effects of this is, where any more is space for a specialist, or indeed a small supplier perhaps, to survive. We're being dominated by companies that maybe that do everything, and products which do more and more. Also, as companies have become converged, if you like, they tend to become global. Think about mobile phone companies, the hardware companies. You've got Apple, you have got Samsung, you have got Sony, you have got, I think, HTC. You've got it's down to maybe 4 or 5 large global companies. Think about how many car companies there are in the world. So you've got General Motors, large ones. General Motors, you've got Ford, you've got Nissan, Toyota, BMW. Again, we're down to maybe about 8 major car companies, 8, maybe 10 in the world. And why there's both convergence on what products do and globalization is very often driven by cost. If you become a huge global company, this pushes down your costs. Now, for one lot of research and development, you are developing a product which does many things and which will sell throughout the world. So you're spreading that research and development very thinly and keeping the cost per unit down. You can shoot one advert and then you can dub it with different languages, and it will do in many markets and so on. And the result of this is again saying, is there or where is there a place for small businesses, small local businesses. And of course some people object to this process. They say the process of globalization of large companies, many of whom are bigger in terms of their wealth than states and countries, they say that this is wrong, and these companies have become too large and perhaps too unaccountable. Whilst we're dealing with international matters, we'll deal here with Porter's diamond. Porter is Michael Porter. We'll be hearing a lot about him, so we will. And Porter's diamond talks about the competitive advantages or competitive advantage of nations. It doesn't fit into the syllabus in any particularly natural way, I don't think, but it has been specifically asked about, and it's only in here, really, because we've dealt with international matters. What Porter realised was that it is pretty well known that certain countries excel at certain products. So, for example, in lectures, every time I ask what is Germany famous for, everyone says cars. And of course, it's got 3 or 4 fantastic car companies: Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, for example, Porsche. You say, what is Japan good for? And people will come back either with cameras, where you have got Nikon, Olympus, Canon, and so on, or consumer electronics like Toshiba and Sony and the like. So we know that certain countries are good for or good at certain things, and Porter began to say, how come this has actually happened? And he said the first thing is factor conditions. So factor conditions can be what's called, first of all, basic factor conditions. You're good at something because maybe you have a good climate. So France is good at making wine because it has a suitable climate for the grapes and good soil. It's unlikely that, for example, Finland will ever become a major wine producer unless global warming really takes off. You can also have advanced factor positions, advanced factor conditions. This is like infrastructure, your communications, your telecommunications, maybe the educational standards of your people. So Ireland, for example, has great advantages when you have American technological companies wanting to open in Europe. So in Ireland, the first language is English. They are in Europe, which is essential. They often have quite low tax rates, which attracts people in. And they have a relatively high birth rate and quite a good educational system. So there are plenty of young people looking for jobs in the high-tech sector. And this has kind of got it right, and Ireland has become, I'd say, quite a centre for United States high-tech companies like Google and Apple. Okay, so we have the factor conditions, and then what Porter says, you start off making for your home market. This is the home demand conditions. So, to start off making stuff at home, for example, Scotland is well known for, apart from whiskey, it's well known for making tweed, thick wool cloth. And one of the reasons is the factor conditions was it had lots of sheep, but the demand conditions is that Scotland has quite wet, windy weather, and tweed, as it's called, is a very, very good substance for keeping you warm and being relatively impermeable. Germans always had a bit of a reputation for liking good, solid engineering, and it was because they wanted good, solid engineering that it kind of spurred on companies like Volkswagen and Mercedes to make good cars. However, if you are a monopolist at home, if you are the only maker of a car in Germany, then there's no reason why you're going to be good. Monopolists are a bit sloppy. They don't have to fight competition. And what gets you world-beating is essentially rivalry. So we just concentrate up here at rivalry. So it's no surprise that in Germany you've got 4 really good car companies. that in Japan you have, say, 4 really good camera companies. The rivalry at home makes you good, makes you world beating, and then you can go out and kind of conquer the world with your products. And finally, what Porter said was you have related and supporting industries. What you kind of get is a cluster of industries. So if we were to think of, say, the western states of America as being particularly strong in IT, this is where you have Intel, Microsoft, Apple, Motorola, Oracle, all kind of over in the West Coast. And the reason is you have got software producers there, you have got electronic chip producers there, you've got hardware producers there. They can all cooperate very well. You've got people maybe move around from one company to another. You get a really solid core of expertise in the country, which reinforces your country's skill at making particular products. I always think this is more of historical interest. I think it's interesting to know why Germany was good at making cars. I'm not sure quite how much application it has to making decisions about the future. So if I was thinking of setting up a car manufacturing company, would I necessarily set it up in Germany, or would I rather set it up perhaps in another country where the manufacturing costs were a lot lower? So this doesn't be the ultimate solution of telling you where you should set up a new company. It's more of, I think, explaining a nice little kind of bit of history of why we're good at certain things. Finally, in the environmental analysis, we get down to what's called Porter's 5 forces, a very important model for this exam. It's used very, very frequently. Again, this is Michael Porter, and he was talking about industry attractiveness. So like the car industry, like the airline industry, like the television industry, like the pharmaceutical industry. So we've gone from the macro environment of PESTEL down to looking at an industry. And he was asking himself the question, what makes an industry attractive to get into? In other words, attractiveness is, can you make good profits? Good profits, good enough to, please your shareholders, but also good enough to do research and development that keeps you in front, keeps you secure. And he said there are 5 things that will determine how easy a time you will have in an industry, and it may determine whether you want to get in there or not. First of all, competition or rivalry. And this presumably goes from a monopoly, only you as a supplier, all the way through the kind of perfect competition. And it's pretty clear you're going to have an easier time in a monopolistic situation. In a monopoly, you can determine what selling price you want to charge. You can determine pretty much free and easily how much you want to spend on advertising. You're not guaranteed to make a profit. You might be a monopoly producer of something nobody wants, but you've got enormous freedoms. In perfect competition, you have got no freedom at all about your price. You have to match the market price. And if one of your competitors suddenly starts advertising, then you probably have to respond. You're going to have quite a rough time in that. What we should always be doing in Porter's 5 forces is to say, well, can I do anything about it? Can I do anything to improve my situation? Is there any way that I could move towards the monopoly position? And one common way is to take over a rival. So the two of you become one. You're heading more towards monopoly. And of course, governments are a bit wary about that. Many governments have competition commissions and the like, because they perceive that a monopolist might abuse their power if they become too powerful. Another way you might do it is that you drop your prices. You know that some of your competitors are financially weak. You drop your prices for 3 months. They have to try and match your prices, and you drive them out of the market. In some industries, you get rid of the competition by shooting them. That's what happens in drug cartels. I'm not advocating that you say this in the P3 exam, but in terms of Porter's 5 forces, it is a perfectly good solution to move you from too much competition into less competition. Next, we have potential entrants, people sitting on the outside of the industry but looking at it, seeing you're making a profit, thinking they might jump in. These people are complete nuisances, because when you go into a market for the first time, you want to go in with a splash, lots of promotion, special offers for the first month and so on, to generate the market for yourself, basically to steal market share from the existing people in the market. And the people in the market already have to respond to this newcomer to try to protect their market share. So what we're looking for here, ideally, is what's called a barrier to entry. And the sort of things which are ranking as barriers to entry are high capital expenditure. It's not going to keep people out absolutely, but if you have to raise a lot of capital, it's a bit of an impediment. It's going to make it harder for people to get in. A lot of know-how. A complicated business. People could get in, but maybe they don't make a success of it because it's kind of too complex. It could be kind of licensing. So if you're going to be getting into, let's say, the airline business, all three of those are going to be there. Quite high capital expenditure, get hold of the airplanes through leasing, for example. A lot of know-how in scheduling your flights and sticking with safety regulations and so on. A lot of licensing. You have to get landing slots at all the places you want to service and so on. Rarely are these going to be an absolute stop to people getting in. Occasionally you get a kind of legal monopoly, but it's relatively rare. But the more barriers to entry, the nicer it is for the people who are in the market already. And then we have suppliers and buyers, really two sides of the same coin. Think what it would be like if you sold 80% of your output to one buyer. You were really at this buyer's beck and call. If this buyer said, I want you to reduce the selling price by 20%, you probably have to do it, because you couldn't really survive perhaps losing 80% of your revenue if this buyer abandoned you. You need to respond to this. So what you might want to do is to try and obviously find new customers. Another thing you can do is you can try to get what's called switching costs. And switching cost is something which makes it relatively difficult, perhaps a little bit expensive, to switch from one supplier to the other. So your buyer sticks with you because it is easier staying with you than moving somewhere else, having a period of disruption. In the UK, people stick pretty well to their bank. It's relatively rare even now to switch banks because it's a lot of bother in a way, and you're worried that your salary will go to the wrong account, or the payments you're making for your rent and insurance are missed out in a month or something of that type. Long-term contracts would be another way perhaps of tying in your buyers a little bit. Instead of waiting from order to order and hoping that another order is going to come in a month, see if your buyer would sign maybe a 3-year contract, maybe give them a little bit off the price, but you might prefer the certainty to the absolute highest price. On the other side, you have suppliers, and again, your nightmare really is a monopoly supplier of a unique component. If this supplier says, I'm going to double the price, you're kind of stuck with it. What you want to try to do is to reduce your dependence on a monopoly supplier. Maybe try to find another one. Maybe try to set up your own supply operation. Maybe what you do to make sure that supply is secure is you decide to take them over, to incorporate them. And then when this supplier is part of you, you can say to the supplier, don't supply my competitors, you only supply me. And finally, we have substitutes. Substitute products are products which in a way achieve the same aim for the consumer, but often using a very different sort of a technology. Again, the mobile phone technology is a substitute for the older landlines. When all we had were old landlines, the traditional phone companies thought they were very safe because there was a very large entry barrier. If you're going to dig up the roads and put in cables into everybody's apartment, in every business, there's an awful lot of capital expenditure to do that. Once mobile phones were invented, it was much cheaper to put in mobile phone networks. You just need some aerials scattered throughout the country. It's not nearly as difficult as running wires into everybody's apartment and so on. And it was a substitute product. You can't push it back. You can't normally suppress substitutes. Once the thing is invented, you kind of have to live with it. And what many traditional phone companies did was they said to themselves, look, mobiles have certain advantages that ordinary phones don't have. I will lose market share to the mobile providers. So what I will do is I will set up a mobile network myself. That's the way they're going to be responding.